Hi, this is Bill, and this is Progpaganda. During the peak of the classic progressive rock era in the early and middle 1970s, keyboards were often featured at the heart of progressive rock songs. And two keyboard types are quite associated with the classic prog rock era. One, of course, is the Moog synthesizer, both the modular Moog, which was favored by artists like Keith Emerson, and the Mini Moog, introduced in 1970, which became a very popular instrument by players like Rick Wakeman and Manfred Mann, among others. The other keyboard that often found its way into progressive rock song arrangements was the Mellotron. The Mellotron, however, was not a brand new instrument. Its history goes back to the early 1960s, and there was quite a bit of usage of the Mellotron during the 1960s before the progressive rock era really took hold. In this episode, I'm going to go over the early history of the Mellotron and review with you some of the songs and some of the early users of the instrument on those songs. I suspect there will be some surprises for some of you on this list, for sure. The Mellotron was first introduced in 1963 by a British company called Mellotronics. They would ultimately change their name to Streatley Electronics and are still known by that name. Streatley's design for the Mellotron in large measure borrowed from an earlier instrument that was designed in the United States by a California company called Chamberlain, and was, in some regards, a lower budget version of that instrument. The key feature of the Mellotron, as many of you I'm sure know, is that it was an analog tape-based instrument meant to reproduce the sounds of individual instruments that had been pre-recorded in advance. The idea behind the Mellotron was that you would record banks of tapes to capture the sounds of the instrument or instruments in question over the course of the several octaves of the instrument's keyboard. These trays of tapes could then be removed from a Mellotron and replaced with those for another instrument. So you could conceivably use a Mellotron to play a string quartet on one song and then change the tray of tapes to make use of choir sounds or sounds of a brass section on another track. In that regard, it was a rather versatile instrument. It wasn't really designed, however, to be taken on the road by bands. The intended market for the Mellotron was that it would be used in homes or perhaps in small clubs. There were two reasons for this. One was to keep on the good side of people in the musicians' union. Musicians were wary of instruments like the Mellotron in that they were fearful that an instrument like this would allow a single keyboard player to take the place of multiple musicians in the course of a session, therefore eliminating the need for the musicians who played those lesser used instruments. The other consideration for the Mellotron that didn't make it terribly roadworthy was that it was made a little bit cheaply. In particular, there was only a single motor that controlled all of the individual tapes within a bank of tapes on the keyboard itself. So if someone, for example, was playing a chord that encompassed 3 keys on the keyboard, that would cause 3 tapes to be pulled through the machine. The motor would have to operate all those 3 tapes. The more keys you press down, the more power was used, and there'd be more strain on the motor to where ultimately the speed of the tapes would suffer in the playback of the various tones that were held down. In other words, it would cause the instrument to go flat, out of tune. Also, in a concert setting, there was a different consideration that also affected the instrument's intonation, which was the heat of the lights on stage. As you had the Mellotron on stage under lights for a considerable period of time, the heat would make the tapes inside of the machine stretch out, and that would cause intonation problems as well. As Robert Fripp of King Crimson would point out, some years later, after King Crimson had made use of the Mellotron for the first several years of that band's existence, Fripp would point out, rather famously, that, quote, tuning a Mellotron doesn't, unquote. From a mechanical perspective, you can see why. The Mellotron, in its first couple of years of existence, wasn't particularly successful from a sales perspective. Very few clubs purchased it. There weren't very many corporate buyers for it either. One of the bigger sales that Streatley made of Mellotron equipment in the early days was to the BBC, to the Beebs Radiophonic Workshop, the group of people who, among other things, created the Doctor Who theme back in 1963. The Mellotron was ultimately discarded by the Radiophonic Workshop because of its relatively cheap design and its intonation problems. That being said, however, though, there were a number of musicians who did find the instrument and began to make use of it. It's generally regarded that the first use of the Mellotron on a recording was by the British band the Graham Bond Organization in 1965 on their second album, There's a Bond Between Us. The Bond Organization had been around for a number of years. Originally as the Graham Bond Quartet, the band was a powerhouse featuring not only Graham Bond, a multi-instrumentalist who played saxophone as well as keyboards, but also Jack Bruce on the bass, Ginger Baker on drums, and John McLaughlin on the guitar. McLaughlin would ultimately exit the band to be replaced by the saxophonist Dick Hextall Smith. They would rechristen themselves as the Graham Bond Organization, and under that name they would make two albums, with the second album, There's a Bond Between Us, featuring the Mellotron in a fairly hefty portion. The Mellotron's featured on several songs, perhaps most notably on the last song on side one of the album, Baby Can It Be True. By the time There's a Bond Between Us was released, Jack Bruce would have left the band. Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker, even back in these very early days, did not get along very well. This was obviously a trait that would haunt them throughout their careers as they worked together in Cream a couple of years later and with other bands going into the 70s and 80s. Jack Bruce would land with Manfred Mann and was featured on one of that band's biggest hits in early 1966, Pretty Flamingo. He might have made Manfred Mann, who was a superb keyboard player, even back in those early days, Bruce might have made Mann aware of the Mellotron in the sense that very shortly after Bruce's departure from the band, Mann would feature the Mellotron on several selections. Another possibility that's also been raised was that Manfred Mann might also have discovered the Mellotron through the guitarist in his earliest bands, Mike Vickers. Vickers was something of a tinker when it came to various musical instruments, and he would ultimately become a salesman for the Moog Corporation in the late 1960s and early 70s. Vickers would be the man who would ultimately introduce Keith Emerson to the Moog synthesizer. But we're getting a little bit off the track here. The point is that Manfred Mann was an early adopter of the Mellotron as well, using it on several selections during 1966. Another early adopter of the Mellotron, and one whose name is very often considered as synonymous with the instrument, is Mike Pinder. By 1967, Mike Pinder was in the Moody Blues, and of course would make great use of the Mellotron over the course of his time with that band in the late 60s and throughout the 70s. But Pinder had an interesting history separate from that of being a performer on the Mellotron. In the early 1960s, prior to the Moody Blues, Mike Pinder actually worked as a tester with Streetly Electronics. As a result, he was very familiar with the inner workings of the Mellotron and how to repair and modify them. So he was a key player of the scene when it came to the use of this particular instrument. And his influence would be felt in a very big way when, through mutual friends, he introduced the Mellotron to John Lennon and Paul McCartney in late 1966. Lennon and McCartney were quite impressed, purchased Mellotrons of their own, ultimately encouraged George Harrison and Ringo Starr to purchase as well. And Lennon would put the instrument to use at the beginning of the sessions that would produce the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album in early 1967 in his writing of Strawberry Fields Forever. Lennon was the primary author of Strawberry Fields Forever, and when it came time to record the song at Abbey Road Studios, it was his Mellotron that would be brought to Abbey Road to make the recording, much to the chagrin of George Martin, who really did not like the instrument much at all. As it turned out, however, it would be Paul McCartney who would embrace the instrument. McCartney is playing the Mellotron on the finished recording of Strawberry Fields, and he would make use both in later recordings with the Beatles as well as in his solo career. The Beatles' influence with the Mellotron didn't stop there, though. The Beatles would leave Lennon's Mellotron at Abbey Road for a time once they were finished recording Strawberry Fields Forever, where for a brief time it fell into the hands of Rod Argent and the Zombies. Argent made use of the Mellotron on the Zombies' last album, recorded in 1967, Odyssey and Oracle. The Mellotron is prominently featured in particular on a song called Care of Cell 44. The story of Odyssey and Oracle may be well known to some of you, but I'll repeat it briefly here. Odyssey and Oracle, being the Zombies' last album, was not promoted particularly hard by its record company. The singles that were released from the album initially, including Care of Cell 44, did not do well. It wasn't until the album was issued about a year and a half later, in early 1969 in the United States, when the song Time of the Season, not featuring the Mellotron, but instead the Hammond organ, became a huge hit, so much so that CBS Records in the United States demanded a follow-up from Rod Argent and the Zombies, who at that time could not provide one. The band had already split up, and Rod Argent, in fact, had already formed his new band, Argent, who released their first album later that year. In addition to Argent and the Zombies, the Beatles' use of the Mellotron also influenced the Rolling Stones, in particular, Brian Jones. Brian Jones and the Stones in general were friends with the Beatles. They socialized regularly on the scene in London. And Brian Jones, who was a very skilled musician and loved to tinker with new equipment and new technology, embraced the Mellotron very quickly, using it to record Their Satanic Majesty's Request, where the Mellotron is used most notably on the two best-known songs from that album, She is a Rainbow and the great 2,000 Light Years from Home. The Beatles' use of the Mellotron also indirectly influenced the Bee Gees. The Beatles and the Bee Gees, as far as I know at least, weren't personally acquainted with each other. Their managers, however, knew each other very well. The Bee Gees' manager, Robert Stigwood, had been a protege of the Beatles' manager, Brian Epstein. at Epstein's firm NEMS Records. In fact, the Bee Gees publishing was owned by a division of NEMS called Nemperor Publishing. So through this connection between the two bands, the members of the Bee Gees had a good sense of the different things that the Beatles were trying in the studio very shortly after the event. Maurice Gibb of the Bee Gees is best remembered these days as the Bee Gees bassist. But in the early days of the band, he not only played bass with the band, but he would generally also play keyboards in the studio. And Mo Gibb is featured rather prominently on several songs that the Bee Gees recorded in the late 60s time frame on the Mellotron. He is playing the Mellotron in particular on two Bee Gees well-known hits, To Love Somebody and I've Got to Get a Message to You, as well as on several superb album cuts, including the song World, and especially on the Bee Gees' early psychedelic track, Every Christian Lion-Hearted Man Will Show You. The Bee Gees would continue to use the Mellotron throughout the 60s and well into the 1970s, prior to their mid-70s emergence as disco stars. By 1968, other bands were discovering the Mellotron as well. We mentioned Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker earlier with their work with Graham Bond and the Mellotron in the Graham Bond organization. By 1968, Bruce and Baker were with Cream, and in fact were beginning to tie up loose ends prior to the dissolution of that band. They had, in late 1968, announced that they would embark on a farewell tour and go their separate ways. They did, however, prior to the farewell tour, record a final half-studio, half-live album called Goodbye. On the studio selections of Goodbye, the Mellotron is featured on two tracks. One is the famous song that Eric Clapton wrote with George Harrison, Badge, on which Harrison also plays with Cream. And the other is a semi-psychedelic song written by Jack Bruce and Pete Brown, sung by Bruce, called Doing That Scrapyard Thing. On both of these selections, Cream's producer, Felix Pappalardi, is playing the Mellotron. Pappalardi was a very skilled musician in his own right, on both keyboards and on the guitar and bass. Shortly after Cream's breakup, Felix Pappalardi would, of course, hook up with Leslie West in the United States and found the band Mountain, with whom he would have considerable success. In 1969, the Mellotron would be featured in a very prominent way by two emerging musicians. In June of 1969, David Bowie's first hit, Space Oddity, featuring the Mellotron, was a huge success. Space Oddity featured, in addition to the then 22-year-old Bowie, a great 20-year-old keyboard player, then unknown, by the name of Rick Wakeman. Wakeman would continue to play on a sporadic basis on Bowie's records between 1969 and 1971 during his tenure with the Strawbs, ending that association with Bowie when he signed on as a full-time member of Yes in late 1971. Finally, last but not least, in July of 1969, King Crimson would record their debut album, In the Court of the Crimson King. Ian MacDonald, their keyboard player, famously used the Mellotron on that song's title track, as well as on the great song Epitaph. The Mellotron, of course, would continue to be used by progressive rock acts into the 1970s, with some very famous uses along the way. Rick Wakeman would, of course, make considerable use of the Mellotron during his tenure with Yes. Tony Banks, with Genesis, would purchase a Mellotron at the urging particularly of Genesis's new guitar player, Steve Hackett, in 1971, and use the Mellotron prominently on several songs, including The Fountain of Salmasius, and especially on the introduction of Watcher of the Skies. One of the more innovative uses of the mellotron in progressive rock came at around the time usage of the instrument was beginning to fade in 1975 in the wake of synthesizers becoming more sophisticated. That usage was by 10cc on what is probably their best-known song, I'm Not in Love. On that song, the song's author, Eric Stewart, along with other members of the band, had the idea to replace the tapes in the storage bank of the Mellotron with tapes of their own voices, resulting in their ability to create backing vocals played on the Mellotron throughout the song for its entire 6 minutes length. An effect that made the song very distinctive, to be sure. There are other uses of the Mellotron that, of course, go beyond this short list. I've mentioned some of the more prominent players of the instrument here, of course, but there are others, I'm sure, that I haven't mentioned that may come to mind for some of you. Feel free to let me know in the comments if there are other players or other song examples that you'd like to make note of in this discussion. The Mellotron was and remains a fascinating instrument and is one that definitely made its mark, both in progressive rock and in other forms of music as well. Let me know what you think. Hit like, hit subscribe, and we'll see you again very soon. Take good care. Bye-bye.